The rescue. The sun was just beginning to slip behind the ragged line of the western hills, painting the horizon in streaks of crimson and gold. A hush hung over the valley as the cattle settled and the wind carried the scent of dust and sage. On the far edge of his land, where the fences leaned and the creek curved, Luke Tanner rode slowly, reins loose in his big weathered hands. Luke was a man people called a ghost among the living. At 39, he had buried both his parents and, most painfully, his young wife, Clara. She had been taken by fever 5 years earlier, leaving him with nothing but the ranch, a hollow heart, and a silence so heavy it had become his second skin. Folks in town said he hardly spoke 10 words a week. He kept to his work, his cattle, his land, and no one expected more from him. But fate, as it often does on the frontier, had different plans. As he neared the stand of cottonwoods by the creek, Luke noticed something unusual, movement where there shouldn't have been any. His hand went to the rifle in the scabbard by his saddle. Coyotes sometimes prowled, and there were rumors of drifters cutting through the valley. He dismounted silently, boots sinking into the soft earth, and moved toward the trees. What he found made him pause. Curled against the roots of a fallen trunk was a woman, her dress torn and dirty, one sleeve soaked with blood. Her chest rose shallowly, and beside her, huddled together, were 2 children, a boy of about 8 and a girl no older than 5. Their eyes, wide and frightened, stared at Luke as though he were another danger come upon them. The boy pressed himself in front of his sister, chin jutting defiantly though his small body shook. "Don't touch us," he warned, his voice cracking. Luke crouched, lowering his rifle, his rough face softening. "Easy," he said quietly, his voice gravel from disuse. "I ain't here to harm you." The woman stirred, her lashes fluttering open. For a moment she looked at him as though unsure if he was real. Her lips moved, but only a whisper came out. He leaned closer and caught the faint words, "Help us." Luke didn't hesitate. He scooped the frail woman into his arms as gently as he could, though she winced at the movement. He glanced at the children. "Come. My place is near. She needs tending." The boy's chin trembled, torn between fear and hope. The girl clung to him, her eyes filling with tears. Finally, with a small nod, the boy rose and followed, keeping a wary distance. Luke placed the woman across his horse, steadying her with one arm as he mounted. The children walked alongside, their small boots kicking dust. The ranch house came into view just as twilight deepened, the old structure weather-beaten but solid, lantern light glowing faintly from within. Inside, Luke laid the woman on his late wife's bed, the only bed with fresh linens, though it twisted his heart to do so. He stoked the fire, boiled water, and with rough but careful hands, cleaned the wound on her arm. The children hovered near the door, whispering to each other in nervous tones. "Name's Luke," he finally said, breaking the silence as he wrapped a strip of cloth around the woman's arm. "What's yours?" The boy straightened. "I'm Daniel. This is my sister, Anna. And she's our mama." Luke glanced at the woman, who watched him with fever-bright eyes. She swallowed hard, her voice hoarse. "Mary, my name is Mary." Luke gave a small nod. "Mary, you'll be safe here tonight." Her eyes brimmed, and for a moment she seemed to wrestle with whether to speak. Then, so faintly he almost missed it, she whispered, "Protect us from him." Luke frowned, leaning closer. "From who?" But Mary's strength gave out. Her eyes rolled shut, and she slipped into unconsciousness. The fire crackled. The children pressed together tightly, their faces pale. Luke stood there, a heaviness filling his chest. He didn't know yet what storm had driven them to his land, but one thing was clear: his lonely ranch was no longer empty, and his quiet life was about to change forever. Shelter and secrets. The next morning dawned quiet, the first pale light spilling over the valley and painting the hills in silver. Luke had been awake since before sunrise, as he always was, But this day was different. Instead of the routine stillness of coffee and chores, there were the soft sounds of children stirring, the rustle of unfamiliar footsteps in his house, and the weight of responsibility he hadn't felt in years. Mary slept fitfully in the bed, her arm bound with clean cloths. Fever had lingered through the night, but she had not worsened. Luke had sat by her for hours, changing the compress, making sure she breathed evenly. Now, as he rose, Daniel and Anna peered at him from the corner of the room where they had curled together on a pallet of blankets. "You hungry?" Luke asked, his deep voice startling them. Anna clung to her brother's sleeve, wide-eyed. Daniel squared his shoulders like a small soldier. "Yes, sir." Luke gave a single nod. "Come on then." In the kitchen, he set about frying bacon and eggs, the familiar crackle of the skillet filling the silence. Daniel's nose twitched at the smell, and Anna's stomach gave an audible growl. Luke caught the sound, and, for the first time in what felt like years, a faint smile tugged at his lips. He fixed plates and slid them across the table. The children ate quickly, as though they hadn't had a proper meal in days. Luke leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee, watching them with a mixture of curiosity and something deeper, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since Clara's passing. When Mary finally stirred and tried to sit up, Luke was there to steady her. "Easy," he said. "You need rest." She blinked at him, confusion flickering in her eyes before memory returned. She saw the children, safe and fed, and relief softened her face. "Thank you for taking us in." Luke only inclined his head. "Any man would've." But Mary shook her head, her gaze steady on him. "No, not every man." Her words unsettled him, as though they carried a weight she hadn't yet explained. Days of uneasy peace. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm. Luke tended his cattle and mended fences, and wherever he went, Daniel shadowed him, eager to help. The boy learned quickly, mimicking the way Luke handled tools, asking quiet but determined questions. Anna, meanwhile, stayed close to her mother, though sometimes she would wander into the yard and chase chickens, her laughter like a sound Luke had nearly forgotten existed. Mary, though weak, insisted on doing small tasks, stirring a pot of stew, folding linens, sweeping the porch. Luke tried to stop her at first, but she only smiled gently and said, "It helps me to feel useful." There was a stubborn dignity in her that reminded him of Clara, and it tugged at something deep in his chest. In the evenings, after the children had fallen asleep, Mary would sometimes sit by the fire while Luke carved wood or repaired tack. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the heavy silence Luke had lived with for years. It was companionable. Still, he saw the shadows in her eyes. When the wind rattled the windows or a coyote howled in the distance, she would stiffen, clutching her children closer. And always, that whispered plea echoed in his mind, "Protect us from him." The truth begins to unfold. One evening, as the firelight flickered, Mary finally spoke of it. "My fiancé," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the flames. "His name is Charles Garrison. He's wealthy, respected in town. To most, he looks like a gentleman." Luke listened, his knife pausing over the wood in his hands. "But behind closed doors," Mary's voice trembled, "he's cruel, controlling. He never laid hands on me at first, but he made it clear I was his property. And when Daniel spoke back to him," she swallowed hard, "that was when I knew we had to leave. I couldn't let my children grow up under his hand." Luke's jaw tightened. His own father had been harsh, though never cruel, but he knew enough of men like that to despise them. "So you ran?" Mary nodded. "We tried to make it west. I thought if we could just reach my sister's family in California, we'd be safe. But he sent men after us. The night you found us, we'd been running for days. I think one of them fired at us. That's how I was hurt." Silence stretched heavy after her confession. Luke set down the carving and looked at her, really looked at her. A woman battered but unbroken, fiercely protective of her children, trembling on the edge of despair yet holding on. "You're safe here," he said finally, his voice low and steady. Mary's eyes glistened. She leaned forward slightly, as if she wanted to believe him fully, but fear still clung to her. "And when he comes—" Luke's hand rested on the rifle by his chair. "Then he'll find out this land ain't his to take." For the first time since arriving, Mary smiled, a small, fragile smile, but real. The bond grows stronger. Over the next week, the ranch seemed to change. Laughter returned to the house, though it was quiet and cautious. Daniel followed Luke everywhere, learning to ride properly, to mend tack, even to rope a stray calf. Anna adored the horses and would sit on the fence for hours, chattering softly as though they were her dearest friends. And Luke, he began to feel something stir in his chest, something he thought had died with Clara. At night, he would catch himself listening for Mary's voice, watching the way firelight caught her hair, the softness in her smile when she looked at her children. One evening, as he tucked Anna into her blankets, the little girl peered up at him and whispered, "Are you our papa now?" Luke froze, words caught in his throat. He had no answer, but the warmth in his chest nearly undid him. He only pulled the blanket higher around her shoulders and said, "Sleep now, little one." But her words echoed in him long after she drifted off. A shadow on the horizon. The peace could not last forever. It was Daniel who noticed it first. He came running from the ridge one afternoon, breathless, his face pale. "Mr. Tanner, I saw men, riders. 3 of them. They were asking down by the creek. I think they're looking for us." Mary's face drained of color. Her hands trembled as she gathered Anna close. "He's found us." Luke felt a fire kindle inside him, a fire he hadn't felt in years. He looked at Mary, at the fear in her eyes, and at the children clinging to her skirts. "They won't take you," he said, his voice like iron. "Not while I'm standing." The storm was coming, and Luke Tanner, the lonely widower who had lived like a ghost, was about to fight for the living once more. The showdown. The days that followed Daniel's warning were tense. Luke Tanner, who had once lived in silence and solitude, now found himself listening for every sound beyond the ranch fences. The crack of a twig, the cry of a crow, the distant pounding of hooves, each one set his instincts on edge. He oiled his rifle and kept it near the door. He sharpened his knife and checked the barn for weak spots. At night, he walked the property with Daniel by his side, teaching the boy how to listen, how to watch the horizon, how to breathe steady even when fear gnawed at the edges of his courage. Mary watched with quiet worry, her hands never still. She mended clothes, cooked meals, and tried to hide her trembling whenever Anna asked, "Mama, will bad men come here?" Mary would only smile faintly and stroke her daughter's hair. "Not while Mr. Tanner is here, darling." Luke caught her eyes once during one of those moments. Her voice was gentle, but her gaze carried both gratitude and fear so deep it nearly broke him. The first sign. It was late afternoon when the first real sign came. A rider appeared on the ridge, far enough that his features were blurred by distance, but close enough that Luke knew he wasn't a stranger passing through. The man sat his horse too still, watching the ranch for too long. Then he turned and disappeared into the trees. "They've found us," Mary whispered when Luke told her. Her face went pale, and her hands twisted in her skirt. "Charles won't stop. He'll come himself if he has to." Luke set a hand on her shoulder, solid and steady. "Then let him. He'll find this place isn't his to claim." Mary searched his face, and in her eyes was a flicker of something Luke hadn't seen before, hope, fragile but growing. Preparing for the storm. That night, Luke showed Daniel how to load the small rifle kept in the barn. The boy's hands shook at first, but Luke's calm voice steadied him. "You don't point it unless you mean it," Luke said, his tone firm but fatherly. "And you don't fire unless there's no choice. Understand?" Daniel swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yes, sir." Mary protested softly when she saw, but Luke placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "It's only in case. I won't let it come to him needing it." For Anna, Luke built a small hiding place in the cellar, stocked with blankets, a lantern, and food. "You'll keep your sister here if anything happens," he told Daniel. The boy's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I will." Through it all, Mary stayed close, her eyes shadowed with fear yet filled with a quiet strength. One evening, as they stood on the porch together, the stars wheeling above them, she finally spoke words that had weighed on her since the day she arrived. "You've done more for us in these weeks than any man ever has," she whispered. "Even when I had a home, I was never truly safe. But here," she trailed off, glancing toward the children's laughter drifting from the barn. "Here, I almost believe we could start again." Luke's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her he felt the same, that the emptiness in him was no longer so hollow. But words had never been easy for him, and before he could speak, a distant sound reached his ears. Hooves. Many hooves. The confrontation. By dawn, the riders came. Dust rose on the horizon as Charles Garrison rode at the head of 6 armed men. He was dressed in fine clothes despite the trail, black coat, polished boots, a hat that shadowed his sharp, arrogant features. Even at a distance, Luke saw the cruel twist of his smile. Mary froze when she spotted him, her breath catching. "It's him," she whispered, clutching Anna to her chest. Luke stepped forward, rifle in hand, his tall frame squared against the rising sun. He said nothing as the men drew closer, but his silence was more commanding than any threat. Charles reined in his horse a few yards from the porch. "Well," he drawled, his voice smooth but dripping with contempt, "what have we here?" "My runaway bride and her brats, hiding behind a dirt farmer." Mary flinched, but Luke didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on Charles, steady as stone. "She's not yours," Luke said at last, his voice low and hard. Charles laughed, tossing back his head. "Everything I touch is mine, rancher. Including her. Now step aside, and maybe I'll let you keep your miserable patch of land." The men behind him shifted, hands near their weapons. The air grew thick, the only sound the creak of leather and the restless snorts of horses. Luke didn't flinch. He lifted the rifle slowly, deliberately, until it leveled with Charles's chest. "You'll turn around," he said, "or you'll leave here in the ground." For a moment, silence reigned. Then Charles's smile faltered. "You think you can stand against me? Against my men?" From behind Luke, Daniel's small voice rang out, steady though thin. "He's not alone." Charles's eyes snapped toward the boy, who stood on the porch clutching the smaller rifle, Anna peeking from behind him. Mary's hand rested on his shoulder, her chin raised with defiance she hadn't dared show before. Something shifted in that moment. Charles sneered, but a flicker of doubt crossed his face. He wasn't facing a broken woman anymore. He was facing a family, held together by the quiet, unshakable strength of one man who refused to bow. The fight. Charles raised his hand, and one of his men went for his gun. The crack of Luke's rifle split the morning air. The man tumbled from his saddle before he'd cleared leather. Chaos erupted. Gunfire roared across the yard. Luke dropped to one knee, firing steady and sure, his movements precise. Daniel herded Anna into the cellar, slamming the hatch shut, before darting back to cover behind the porch rail with his rifle. Mary knelt beside him, reloading Luke's spare weapon with trembling but determined hands. 2 more of Charles's men fell before the others broke, spurring their horses toward the trees. The yard filled with dust and shouts, but Luke stood firm, his eyes never leaving Charles. The man sat frozen, fury twisting his features. "You'll regret this, Tanner," he spat. "No woman is worth dying for." Luke stepped forward, his rifle unwavering. "She's worth more than you'll ever be." For the first time, Charles faltered. He looked around. The bodies of 2 men sprawled in the dirt, the rest vanished into the hills, and before him, a widower who would not yield. He sneered, but it lacked conviction. With a harsh tug on his reins, he wheeled his horse and rode off, disappearing in a cloud of dust. The ranch fell silent again, save for the ringing in Luke's ears. A new beginning. When the smoke cleared, Mary rose slowly from behind the porch, her eyes wide with relief and disbelief. She hurried to her children as Daniel emerged from hiding, Anna clutching his hand. Both children ran to Luke, clinging to him without hesitation. Mary's gaze found his, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. "You saved us," she whispered. Luke shook his head. "No. We saved each other." For a long moment, they stood there in the golden morning light. Mary, Daniel, Anna, and Luke. A family forged not by blood, but by choice, by courage, by love. Later, as they sat together by the fire that night, Mary laid her hand gently over Luke's. He didn't pull away. "You've given us a home," she said softly. "And if you'll have us, we'll give you one too." Luke looked at her, at the children curled nearby, and felt the hollow place inside him finally fill. For years he had lived like a ghost. But now, with them, he was alive again. And for the first time since Clara's death, Luke Tanner allowed himself to believe in tomorrow.